Thank you so much, Shannon. And thank you to all of you who are in attendance tonight. Wow, this is a great turnout. For those of you who don't know me, I am Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. I use he, his pronouns, and I am so excited to get really nerdy with you tonight and go over lots of voter data. So as those of you know who have attended our webinars before, we really try to respect your time. We try to not go longer than we say we are going to do. And so we're just going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. All right. This is what you have in store tonight. We're going to start with a very, very quick introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. For those of you who are brand new to EVP tonight, please understand this webinar is not going to be a general introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. If you want to learn more about our work, we will be providing links throughout the webinar where you can learn more about our work. However, I will give a very, very, very brief introduction at the beginning. Then, because what we're talking about tonight is our expansion into 2 new states, I'm going to briefly go over the criteria we use in order to decide whether to expand into particular states. Then I'm going to go over a lot of the really, really interesting voter data and research that we've got coming out of Louisiana and Nebraska. I'm then going to discuss why we didn't expand into other states, such as, say, Wisconsin. I know Wisconsin is on a lot of people's minds these days for very good reason. And then we're going to close with some big things that you can expect coming from us over the next few months, some great opportunities for all of you as people who support our work or volunteers who help us contact donors. And then, as Shannon said, we will have a great Q&A session at the end. That being said, if you have questions throughout any of this, please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A. Shannon will try to answer some of them. Others she might save for our Q&A session at the end. All right. Let's go ahead and get started. In a nutshell, the Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that is just laser focused on identifying environmentalists who don't vote and then turning them into better voters. That's it. That's what we do. We find non-voting environmentalists and we try to turn them into more consistent, habitual voters. What is helpful to understand about us is what this means that we don't do a lot of the things that you might typically expect from an environmental nonprofit. For instance, we don't endorse candidates, we don't lobby for particular policies, and we don't even try to convince people to care more about climate or clean air or clean water. A good way to think of us is we are not even in the mind-changing business or opinion-changing business. Instead, we are solely in the behavior-changing business. What we try to do, and you'll see it in this 3-step process here, is bypass all of the people who need issue education, bypass all the people who need to be persuaded, and instead just go right to the people who are already with us. They're just not voting. And so we need to try to nudge them into becoming better voters. And we do it with this 3-step process. First, identification. We build predictive models, which are a data science tool that allows us to individually identify people based on the issues they prioritize most. And in this particular instance, we're concerned with people who care so deeply about climate and the environment that it's quite literally their #1 priority over all other issues. Then, once we can isolate that segment of voters, we get rid of the ones who are already good at voting. They don't need us, right? They don't need a behavioral intervention. They don't need anybody to help them show up on election day. They're already doing that. Instead, we only focus on the people who do need to get better at voting. That's when step 2 comes in. We canvass, we call, we send postcards, we send direct mail, we send digital ads, all with behavioral science-informed messaging designed to do just one thing, and that is get these people to vote. We run hundreds of randomized control trials, very sophisticated experiments each year, just figuring out how to optimize this messaging. And oftentimes we're sending different messages to different subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists because we know from previous experiments which messages work best with which of these people. And then finally, even if we do get some of these low propensity environmental voters to vote in an election, we don't just leave it there. We are in the business of, over the medium and long term, dramatically growing the power of the environmental movement. And so we take this third step, habit reinforcement, very, very seriously. We never let an election go by without using it as an opportunity to talk to these voters and turn them into habitual voters. And I really mean that. I mean, we've spoken to people in library trustee elections. We will use any election, even one that has nothing to do with environmental policymaking, as an opportunity to change people's behavior. So this is how we do the work that we do. We've been getting some great results. Just last year in 2022, you'll see, with thousands of volunteers and a budget of over $3.2 million, we were able to contact an enormous number of people across 17 states and talk to them in multiple ways over multiple local, primary, and general elections. Ultimately, we were able to prove in our randomized control trials that we were solely responsible for some pretty dramatic increases in turnout. Now, you'll notice at the top it says incomplete. We're still getting updated voter files from a few states here. But what you're looking at is really, really new data. We haven't released this yet. And we're extraordinarily proud that you'll see in some primaries and special elections, we increased turnout as much as 2 or 3.5 percentage points over our control group, while, I might add, controlling for all outside variables. In general elections, we increased turnout as much as 1.2 percentage points over our control group. These are big numbers in the election business. You can ask any candidate who's ever run for anything how big a deal 1 or 2 or 3% is, and they'll let you know. We're very, very proud of these numbers. Moreover, over multiple years, our cumulative impact, because this is our true goal, right? Remember what I said, we're looking at the medium and long term to try to dramatically grow the political power of the environmental movement. Well, you can see what our cumulative impact has been. In 7 years now, we've now been involved in almost 1,600 different elections. We have now communicated with 9.5 million unique individual environmental voters, all of whom were unlikely to vote or we wouldn't have been talking to them. And what we can tell you now is, as of about a month and a half ago when we took all these measurements, 1.5 million out of those 9.5 million are voting so consistently now that they voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They have become super voters, such that even if you are running for dog catcher, you're going to say, oh yeah, these people are going to vote. We got to talk to them. We got to poll them to figure out what issues they care about. This is how you drive demand for climate leadership from politicians. Because at the end of the day, politicians have to go where the votes are, or they don't get to be politicians anymore. And we are enormously proud of the fact that over the past 7 years, with all of you, we have helped bring 1.5 million new environmental voters to the electorate in these 17 states. All right. I told you the introduction would be short. That is it. If you would like to learn more about our work, and about our results, there will be some helpful links in the chat. And what I'll also tell you is, don't worry, very soon we're going to be releasing all of our results from 2022. We're still waiting for a little bit with our annual impact report, and we'll have another briefing webinar like this, where we go over all of our results in all of our states, as well as some of our messages that performed really well and some messages that didn't perform well. All right, that's the intro. Now let's get into expansion, because that's what this webinar is about today. All right, there's one of the links that you can go to that I mentioned. When we decide where to work, whether it is staying in one of our existing states or expanding into a new state, there are three criteria that we look at. First is, we need lots of targets. We want to find states that have lots of non-voting environmentalists or seldom voting environmentalists, people who for lots of elections are going to be unlikely to vote. Because if we don't have that big fat denominator, if we don't have lots of targets, to be honest, it kind of doesn't matter how good we are at turning non-voters into voters. If there just aren't that many people for us to work on, even if we get them all to vote, it's not going to change much. It's not going to change policymaking. And so the first thing, and perhaps the most important thing that we look for, is always lots of non-voting environmentalists. All right. Second thing, we want an active election calendar. As good as we might be in testing and optimizing our messaging, the embarrassing truth is that our intelligence isn't as important as our stubbornness. We need lots of elections. The only way to turn a non-voter into a voter is to get them to vote in an election. And so if you are a state like Georgia that has like elections and runoff elections like 5 times a year, our opportunity to talk to these voters and change their habits is so much bigger than it is in a state like, say, Oregon, where for good government reasons, they've gotten rid of all their odd year elections, and now everything coincides with these big even year elections, which is largely very good policymaking. I don't blame them for doing that. But that really limits the ability of a group like the Environmental Voter Project to get multiple bites at the apple and change these people's behavior. Third criteria we look at is, we are not just concerned with moving the dial at the federal level. We don't just seek out states that are important for the Senate or for the White House or things like that. Is that nice? Sure, it's nice. Of course it's nice. But we also care about moving the dial on climate policymaking and environmental policymaking at the state and local levels too. And so we want to have that really, really efficient payoff, such that if we go into a state, we know that there are tons of targets. We're going to have lots of opportunities to talk to them. And every new voter we make is going to have a ripple effect, not just on federal policymaking, but state and local policymaking too. That's what we look for. That's what we look for. All right. So with that in mind, just maybe 3 weeks ago, as many of you know, we announced that we are expanding into Louisiana and Nebraska. We had been in these 17 states, these dark green states that you see down there. And then you'll see Louisiana and Nebraska have been added. And so now these are the 19 states that the Environmental Voter Project is working in, day out. We've already been active in, I believe, 14 or 15 different elections just since January 1st this year. So just over the first 8 or 9 weeks, we've been active in that many elections. And as you'll see, the gray states are states that we are not in. And don't worry, we're going to, as I mentioned, discuss those as well. So what was it about Louisiana and Nebraska that we thought made them such great opportunities for an organization like ours? And what did we learn once we started building these predictive models and doing lots of voter file research in these states? Well, before I get into that, sorry, I need to give you one little caveat. I'm going to be using a lot of demographic terminology here. And I just want to let you know that because we are working off of voter files, we think that the most precise thing to do is to use the same terminology that is in voter files. So what that means is voter files don't have gender, they have sex. And so because sex is not analogous to gender, we are just going to use those sexual terms that are in, those sex terms rather, that are in the voter file. And so we're going to use male, female identifiers. Race. There's a lot of seemingly sort of antiquated racial terminology in the voter file, African American, Caucasian, things like that. But because a lot of this nomenclature isn't perfectly analogous to a lot of the terms that are used these days, like African American isn't perfectly analogous to Black, Hispanic isn't perfectly analogous to Latino or Latinx, we are going to try to use the terminology that's in voter files. And finally, you'll notice that there's some data that is incomplete. That's because some states don't ask for a lot of this demographic data, and it needs to be picked up from consumer vendors. All right, now we're ready to jump into things. Why Louisiana? Well, first of all, it is the heart of the fossil fuel industry. It is the heart of the fossil fuel industry. And largely because of that, although not all because of that, it is on the front lines of every climate and environmental crisis you could possibly imagine. Sea level rise, extreme weather, air pollution, water pollution, environmental racism. In short, like, Louisiana is where the problems are worst. And so I would suggest to you that we need a really excuse to not be in Louisiana. Now, fortunately, we found a lot of good reasons to be there, as you will see. But we're very, very glad that we found those reasons, because Louisiana needs the help of the environmental movement. Louisiana also has an open gubernatorial election this year. John Bell Edwards, the Democratic incumbent, is term limited and can't run for another term. Possibly over the next few weeks, we'll be finding out that New Orleans has a mayoral recall election. The state also has publicly elected utility regulators. That is obviously an important handle for those of us who care about climate and environmental policymaking. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, they have an enormous number of non-voting environmentalists. Is that frustrating? Yes, of course it's frustrating, but it's also an opportunity. It means that an organization like the Environmental Voter Project can have an enormous impact. Because what it means is there's this huge pool of latent political power for the environmental movement in Louisiana. All right, so what does that pool look like? Well, in Louisiana, when we built these predictive models that I briefly referred to earlier, we were able to identify almost 145,000 already registered voters who care so deeply about climate and the environment that it's their #1 priority, yet they have never voted in a presidential election before. Say that again. They're already registered to vote. Climate and the environment's their #1 priority, but they don't even vote in presidential elections. That is a big, big number. Provide some context down here. You'll see not even 2.2 million ballots were cast in the last presidential election in Louisiana. So this is a big number. This year's gubernatorial election, we identified 320,000 registered voters in Louisiana who list climate and the environment as their top priority, who have never voted in a gubernatorial. That is a huge, huge number. And as you'll see, only 1.5 million people cast ballots last time there was a gubernatorial in Louisiana. So that's a big, big opportunity. All right, who are these people? Who are these non-voting or seldom voting environmentalists who are already registered, yet they're not casting ballots? They need our behavioral interventions. Who are these people in Louisiana? Well, if you go down at the bottom, you'll see we've got 2 rows of data, of percentages here. At the bottom is what all registered voters look like in Louisiana. So you'll see 8.2% of all registered voters in Louisiana are age 18 to 24. 45% of all registered voters in Louisiana are male. 1.6% are Hispanic. The line above it, that's also registered voters, but these are our EVP targets. These are these non-voting environmentalists, and we just keyed this data to these presidential non-voters. And as you'll see, there are some dramatic differences. The first thing that really jumps out is, holy moly, is this population disproportionately young, right? That probably doesn't come as a surprise to anybody. People who care deeply about the environment tend to skew very young, but look at how dramatic it is, right? I mean, what, 71% are 18 to 34 years old among our targets, whereas in the overall electorate, it's just 25%. Big, big difference. Another thing you'll see here, I want you to look at ages 35, 49, 50 to 64, and 65 and up. What you see here is something that we are now starting to see in all of our states from this latest round of voter research that we've seen. Namely, it is no longer accurate to say the older you are, the less likely it is that you care deeply about climate and the environment. It is far more nuanced than that. Yeah, there are a whole bunch of young people who care deeply about it way down here, right? But we now consistently see this dip where 35 to 49-year-olds, not that many of them care about climate and the environment. 50 to 64-year-olds, oh my gosh, they are nowhere. And then 65 and up are significantly higher than both of those 2 age groups. And for those of you who are wondering whether there's some other factor that's driving this, when we poll vote propensity, these numbers stay the same. So in other words, even if we don't pay attention to non-voters, if we just look at super environmentalists, we see the same sort of like U-curve or Nike swoosh, I guess. And you'll see, look at registered voters. These 3 age groups are the same exact size in Louisiana. These 65 and older people are now much, much more likely to care deeply about climate and the environment than middle-aged people are. All right, what else did we notice in Louisiana? Not much of a gender gap. You'll see the gender distribution is almost exactly the same as it is among all registered voters. But then look at these racial demographic breakdowns. If you look at all registered voters in Louisiana, there are twice as many white voters as Black voters. If you look at our target population, it flips. It completely flips, and there are twice as many African Americans as there are whites. This is something that we also now see in pretty much all of our states, but not nearly as dramatically as we're seeing it here in Louisiana. This is dramatic. This is dramatic. We don't see it fairly dramatically here in Louisiana, but Asian American and Pacific Islander voters, we are also seeing that they disproportionately care deeply about climate and the environment. And you see a little bit of that here, a little bit of that here. All right, moving on. Politically, you can see these are Louisiana's 6 congressional districts. And the first thing that should jump out at you is, holy moly, are these the most gerrymandered districts you could possibly imagine? Usually you don't see enormous partisan lean numbers like this. And what these partisan leans are, they're from the Cook Political Report. What this means is, if there is an election, you look at the average congressional district. This district, Louisiana 1, skews 23 points more Republican than the average district. And that's looking back at the last 4 national elections. So last two midterms and last two presidentials. That's a big skew. And you can see all of the districts are really big, but you can also see, oh man, is this what's called a packed district? Louisiana 2. So many Democrats are packed in there. In fact, so many Black Democrats are packed in there that the Supreme Court is going to be ruling on Merrill v. Milligan soon, a Voting Rights Act case, to decide whether drawing this district this way actually is unconstitutional and contravenes the Voting Rights Act. We'll see. As I'm sure many of you know, the Voting Rights Act has been watered down every session under the current court. Whether it will be watered down again, we don't know, but there is at least a possibility that there will be brand new districts drawn in Louisiana later this year, depending on that Supreme Court ruling. And there might be a very competitive district added in here. All right. Oh, and as you can see over in this column, it's all of the targets that we have identified at the Environmental Voter Project, all of these unlikely to vote environmentalists. All right, I want to speed ahead so we can leave time for our Q&A. Let's get to Nebraska. Why Nebraska? Very active odd-year election calendar, like Louisiana. Also elected utility regulators, both at the statewide public power district level, but also in a few local areas as well. A really, really close toss-up congressional district in Nebraska too, and I'm going to talk more about that in a second. Also wanted to, I am not a policy guy, as many of you guys know. I'm a political hack. I'm not a policy hack. But, farm policy is a very important frontier for the climate movement. Whether you are growing crops or raising livestock, all of the feed and water that goes into agriculture has an enormous impact on climate, not to mention water quality. And so this is going to be very important at the federal level, and Nebraska drives a lot of policymaking on farm decisions at the federal level. And then finally, again, lots of non-voting environmentalists. So let's see what I'm talking about here. We identified almost 42,000 of these already registered super environmentalists who have never voted in a presidential election in Nebraska. What does that mean in a state like Nebraska? Well, not even 1 million people cast ballots last time there was a presidential election there. So that is not a small number. Now, on odd years, Nebraska doesn't always have full statewide elections, so we don't have a context for this next number, or at least a reliable context. But we identified 148,000 of these registered super environmentalists who skip their odd year local elections. Huge, huge number. Again, when you consider that there are fewer than 3 million who are even registered in Nebraska. And obviously there's never an election where all registered voters show up. All right. What do these non-voting environmentalists look like? Well, similar to Louisiana, you'll see they're disproportionately young, although not quite as dramatically as we saw in Louisiana. Also, as we saw in Louisiana, there's that kind of like demographic, like Nike swoosh there, or that U, where middle-aged people, especially in the 50s and early 60s, are very underrepresented among these super environmentalists. But then the over 65 crowd, or 65 and up crowd, they come back up again. Spoiler alert, it isn't just Louisiana and Nebraska where we are seeing this. We are now seeing this in all of our states. So stay tuned. We're going to be releasing a lot more data, but keep this in your head. This is very important for those of us in the climate movement. There are a whole bunch of climate grandparents out there, and that's not just like a fun line to say. It's the truth. It's in the data. It's in the data. All right. I mentioned at the top that we have some incomplete demographic data in some states because some states don't actually collect data, in this instance, on voter sex. And so it has to be gotten from third-party vendors. And you see we have a lot of unknown here. But you'll see, there's a little bit of a gender gap, a little bit of more of a gender gap than we see in the overall voter file in Nebraska, with women being much more likely than men to list climate as a top priority, but it's not enormously dramatic, not as dramatic as we were seeing 2 or 4 years ago. And then finally, when we look at race, Nebraska is an overwhelmingly white state, but this target population of low propensity environmental voters that we're going after is far less white, as you'll see. So African-American voters are twice as represented in our target population as they are in the overall universe of registered voters. Asian American and Pacific Islander voters are 3 times as represented. Native American voters are 7 times as represented in our target population. Again, these are things that don't seem as dramatic in Nebraska because Nebraska is overwhelmingly white, but Black voters, AAPI voters, Indigenous voters, this is the same overrepresentation that we're actually seeing in all of our states now. With Hispanic voters, it's starting to get a little bit more nuanced. We'll be presenting some of this data to you more in the coming weeks, but in short, what we're seeing among Hispanic voters is that in certain states, like Florida, there's really no difference between registered voters and our target populations. Whereas in states like Arizona and Texas, Hispanics still disproportionately care about climate and the environment. All right. Congressional districts. This is what I meant by that second congressional district. It has 0 partisan lean, 0. It is about as close as you can get to the median congressional district in the United States. Don Bacon, a Republican, won it. See, we have a significant number of non-voting environmentalist targets there. These are people who don't even vote in presidential elections. And perhaps most importantly, and I say this with the knowledge that I'm gonna make people grab their chests and get really anxious here. It has a standalone electoral college vote. As some of you likely know, there are only 2 congressional districts that carry their own electoral college vote, Nebraska 2nd and Maine 2nd. Boy, is it hard to game out the 2024 presidential election and not get the sense that these 2 standalone electoral college votes are going to be important. And I know you don't want to hear that, but I think we all kind of need to hear that. This is going to be a very, very important district. As a proof point of that, in 2020, under the old district, Biden won by just 22,000 votes to get that one sole electoral college vote. The way that the new district is drawn, it has gone from being a Democrat +3 district to an even district. So it is now shifted 3 points more Republican, all else being equal. It's going to be very, very important. All right. That is why, at least in 15 or 20 minutes, why we are expanding into Nebraska and Louisiana. We see enormous opportunities there to grow the political power of the environmental movement. It is important for moving policymaking from local utilities all the way up to the White House. And we have identified huge numbers of non-voting environmentalists in those states. And so we are very excited to now be working in these 19 states where we feel like we can have an enormous impact. That being said, I did want to address the elephant in the room here, and that is, why not some other states, right? Like Michigan's kind of important. Ohio, Wisconsin, holy moly, is that important? Montana, that's important. And because some of you specifically have been asking about Wisconsin for a while now, and believe me, I know why, I did just want to address some of our thinking around this, because believe me, If I announced that the Environmental Voter Project was expanding into Wisconsin, it would be very easy to raise money for it. It would be very easy to get volunteers excited for it. But we became increasingly convinced that it would be kind of dishonest to do this. Because the truth is, the Environmental Voter Project can't have an impact in many of these states. And we can't have a big impact in Wisconsin. And here is one set of data, just one out of dozens of sets of data that show that. What you see here, we just picked some of this battleground states that EVP works in, as well as our two new expansion states, Louisiana and Nebraska, and then Wisconsin. And you'll see over in this column, we listed the number of super environmentalists we've now identified in each of these states who are such poor voters that they don't even vote in presidential elections. Excuse me. And as you can see, there are some enormous numbers here. Look at Georgia, 470,000 registered voters care deeply about the environment and haven't even voted in a presidential. What does that mean in a state like Georgia? Well, barely 5 million cast ballots in 2020. So that means our target population in 2024 is so big, it's almost 9.5% of all ballots that were cast. That is a big, big number, even if you ignore the fact that there was a teeny margin in Georgia in 2020. And as you'll see in all these other states, not only are the raw numbers of non-voting environmentalists that we were able to identify enormous, but they are proportionately big if you consider them as a numerator over a denominator of how many people typically vote in those states. These are powerful potential pools of political power for the environmental movement. Then look at Wisconsin. We could only identify something like 50,000 super environmentalists who didn't vote in midterms in Wisconsin, and fewer than 37,000 who skipped presidentials. That's fewer than we identified in Alaska. It's nothing. Now, yes, I see this number down here. I know how close the margins are in Wisconsin. I would never claim to any of you that Wisconsin is a politically unimportant state. It is just the opposite. It is an extraordinarily important state. But that's why we're not working there. Part of the reason there are so many of you, an incredible number of you, on a Zoom call right now in February or March in an odd year to learn about what we are doing is because you trust that when you volunteer for us, your time and effort and talent is going to have an impact. You trust that when you donate to us or you support us through your philanthropic giving, that it will have a big, big impact. And we couldn't look you in the face and say, yes, your work and your donations will have a big, big impact if we went into some of these other states, not with the data that we are seeing. And so, believe me, I am enormously grateful, we all are, that so many of you now view the Environmental Voter Project as one of the primary vessels of your political giving and your political activism. We are enormously grateful for that. But we take that trust seriously. And I'm telling you, we can't have a big impact in Wisconsin. We can't. So that's why we're not going there. The good news is we can have an enormous impact in the 19 states where we're active, and states that are really important, like Georgia and Pennsylvania and Arizona and North Carolina and Nevada. And as a reminder, this is the kind of impact we can have over the long term. Huge, huge numbers of brand new environmental voters. All right, I'm going to speed to the finish so we can get to our Q&A. What's coming up next at EVP? Well, hopefully in the next 2-3 weeks, we're going to be able to release all of our results from 2022. We're also going to be releasing some more research of the kind that you've seen here. We're going to be mobilizing voters in tons of elections. More on that in a second. In April, for Earth Week, we are going to have days of action. When it comes to Earth Week, we like to treat it like Election Day. And so we are going to be mobilizing voters during Earth Week, probably for very important elections coming up in Pennsylvania and Colorado. Again, more on that as well. And then, yes, more of the same in May and June, research and mobilizing voters. Just this month, we have a huge number of volunteer opportunities for you. And hopefully there will be a link in the chat so you can sign up. You can see, Georgia, Florida, Arizona, New Hampshire, Louisiana, Nebraska, Alaska, Colorado, tons of amazing opportunities. And believe me, the cheapest, easiest way to make a new voter in 2024 is to start talking to them in 2023. These are really, really high impact opportunities. We also have some high impact funding opportunities coming up. Obviously, there are a whole bunch of elections, but I did just want to highlight a few really, really important ones before we get to the Q&A, because these elections are super high impact, like high return for the money that we spend and the money you donate. And they're coming up. We're going to be mobilizing voters for these in the next, 3 to 9 weeks. Anchorage, Alaska, municipal election. Jacksonville, Florida, mayoral. Many people don't realize this. Jacksonville is enormous. It's the 12th largest city in the country. It is more than double the size of Miami. And it is the largest city in the country with a Republican mayor. It's a big city, almost 1 million people. Lincoln, Nebraska mayoral general election. For those of you who aren't familiar with Lincoln, it's the size of St. Louis, Missouri. This is not a small city. It's very, very important. An open Philadelphia mayoral primary. The primary is the whole game in Philadelphia mayoral elections. The current mayor was term limited. It's a big, wide open field for a very, very important mayoral position. Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, that's where Pittsburgh is. The county executive, again, the primary is the whole game here. The county executive has a lot of power, including oversighting of fossil fuel infrastructure. This is extraordinarily important. I don't need to tell any of you, after what has just happened in the upper Ohio River Valley, how impactful fossil fuel industry and transportation infrastructure can be on the people in this area. And then finally, Colorado Springs municipal runoff election. Again, many people don't realize how big a city this is. It's almost 500,000 people, almost 500,000 people. Colorado Springs is pretty much the size of Atlanta, Georgia. It also has a municipally run utility. These are big, big opportunities, and we would love to have your financial support. You can donate online. No limit. You can donate as much as you want. You can write checks to us. You can email me at nathaniel@environmentalvoter.org, and I can send you information to wire funds or gift stock to us. All right. Now we are at the end. We still have 15 minutes. Hopefully I'll be able to answer a whole bunch of questions and we can let you out on time. But thank you for sitting through that enormous data dump. So, all right, Shannon, what do we have from questions here?
Yeah, I'm going to jump right in because there were a lot of questions. So first one, so especially going back to Louisiana, do you have some data as to whether proximity to fossil fuel infrastructure is correlated or related to where our environmentalists are or where these voters might be?
Yes. Let me pull this up here. Are you seeing the slide deck now, Shannon?
Yes.
Great. Okay. All right. So look at this extraordinarily gerrymandered district that I pointed out before, the 2nd Congressional District. Not only is that a congressional district, that is almost perfectly the outline of something that many of you have probably heard of, and that is Cancer Alley. This run from New Orleans up to Baton Rouge is pretty much the most toxic place in the United States. It also happens to be where a huge, huge number of our target voters are. And also remember, our target voters in Louisiana were disproportionately Black. So what does this mean? It means that in Louisiana, yes, there is an enormous correlation and a causation. We know that from a lot of research that Pew Research has done, that people who are right next to fossil fuel infrastructure are much, much more likely to care deeply about these issues. But we see it here as well with this like perfect storm of environmental racism and racial gerrymandering that is sapping the political power of Louisiana's Black population, while government subsidized industry is poisoning their air and water. I mean, this is a gross moral failure. And we feel tremendously fortunate that we have the opportunity to go in here and try to empower the people who are living in Cancer Alley, who so clearly have far less political power than they deserve and than they need. And so, yeah, we see a really, really strong set of causal arrows there. Absolutely.
Great, thank you so much. A bunch of folks have a question about our model. So could you talk more about what goes into that model and how we know that a particular voter that a volunteer is calling actually does care about climate?
Absolutely. And so first I'll just say, Shannon, if you wouldn't mind putting in the link or putting in the chat a link to our introduction video on our YouTube page. We go into a lot of detail on that introduction to EVP video about how we build these models. But very, very briefly, we start by polling tens of thousands of people. And we ask them, what is your number one most important political priority? We then isolate people who tell us climate, clean air, clean water. Then we work with data scientists to figure out, okay, what do we know about these people? These people who just told us climate's their number one priority. What data is there in voter files? What census data is there? What publicly available behavioral and consumer data is there? We only use publicly available data, but there's a lot of it out there. And then what we do is we use that to try to figure out, okay, how can we find other people like them? How can we find other folks in the voter file who share the same profile as these people who just told us that climate or other environmental issues are their top priority? And it's a long, iterative process, and there are lots of different profiles of people who care deeply about climate and the environment. But at the end of the day, what we are able to do is assign a score from 0 to 100 to every single person in a state voter file, telling us how likely they are to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally list it as their number one priority over all others. And these models are frighteningly accurate. They are frighteningly accurate. When we have tested the accuracy of these models in the past, we've cut off the top 15%, the people who score 85 and above, and we have just called them back and we've said, hey, what's your number one most important political priority? And every single time, at least 85% of them off the top of their head said, oh, climate change, why do you ask? These are very, very accurate. And because they are accurate, we aren't the only people doing it. These are the same tools that now presidential campaigns and sophisticated Senate campaigns use to target voters. So because of that, what we know is every time a volunteer is reaching out to one of these voters, we are not 100% certain. No one is 100% certain of anything. We are not 100% certain that these people are climate activists. But what we do know is that there is at least an 85% likelihood that they care so deeply about these issues that it's their number one priority. So that's the process. There's more information at that link that we shared, and we'd love for you to dig deep into it because it's really nerdy and interesting stuff.
Great. All right. So once you've identified those folks, you talked a lot about our messaging and our messaging being effective. Could you give folks an example or two about what a message to a voter might actually sound like from us, and similarly, the type of message that doesn't work as well?
Great question. Okay, so I'll give two examples, but please just understand that we test and experiment with a whole bunch of things. We really care about getting this right, and because we're active, I mean, we've now been like almost 1,600 elections over the past 7 years. We can test a lot, so we want to test different things. An example of something that has worked really, really well is something called loss aversion messaging. Very, very briefly, the concept behind loss aversion is most people fear losing things more than they're excited about getting something. So if you lose $5 out of your pocket, you'll be more bummed about losing that $5 than you are excited about finding $5. Maybe you don't think that applies to you, but by and large, it applies to a dramatic majority of people. So how does loss aversion apply to voter turnout messaging? Well, there are a whole bunch of people who vote in presidential elections, but no other elections. And we think that's a really valuable group of people to use this loss aversion messaging with. So what we do is we reach out to them with direct mail or with postcards or things like that. And we say, thank you for voting in 2020. Don't ruin your perfect voting record, or don't ruin your good voting record in 2022. The idea is we are not making the act of voting in this down ballot election seem like a new thing that they have to do for the first time. Instead, we are endowing them with something of value, the fact that they voted recently, and we're saying, don't screw it up. Don't lose it. You now have a good voting record. Don't mess it up. And as you can see in some of our results, we got dramatic increases in turnout in 2021 local elections on this. We also, on our results page, have some studies looking just at this loss aversion messaging, and we sent turnout through the roof in Pennsylvania last year using this. All right, that's something that works. What is something that doesn't work? Okay, I'm going to reach for an example here. Now you're going to giggle, but I told you sometimes we try to like test crazy things. There's a whole bunch of anthropological experiments that show primates, not just human beings, but primates in general, can't resist a smile. You see a smile, and any primate will smile back. The opposite of that is if you see a frown, oh, you stop. There have actually been some really cool behavioral experiments in England where you see those like flashing speed limit signs. People kind of slow down. They're like, oh, I'm going 35 miles per hour. Maybe I'll slow down. If you add a frowny face to it, people will like slam on their brakes. It's a really powerful thing. So we thought, hey, let's try something like that. And we experimented with this. Voter smiley face, non-voter frowny face. Yeah, I know, pretty weird. But we thought there's lots of good science to back this up. And on the back, we actually cited some public health research that said studies show that voting makes you happy. The American Medical Association has declared that voting is a social determinant of health. And then we put footnotes and cited those sources. It didn't work. We thought it would be a really good thing to try. It didn't depress turnout, but it also didn't increase it. We like to experiment with things like this because we have the ability to. And if we find something that works, even if it only works with a small subpopulation of our targets, we can then share it with other groups and we can double down on it ourselves. So there's an example of something that works really well, and something that didn't work at all.
Awesome. It's like you were ready for that with that example right on your desk.
I have a lot of trash on my desk, Janet.
Yeah, I've got some postcards, which folks can check out also in the reports I linked in the chat in case people want more examples there. All right, so we talked about the criteria that went into adding states. Maybe to wrap us up with this last question, did we consider removing any states, or did we remove any states?
Really, really great question. We always consider removing states. So every 2 years, I say that as though we've been around forever, like every 2 years. But pretty much every 2 years since we've started, we have done a full 50-state research project where we've dug into every single state to figure out those 3 criteria that I mentioned previously. And that includes states that we are still working in, because we want to see if opinions are changing or voting habits are changing, or if we're just running out of targets to convert. Because truth be told, at the end of the day, the goal of the Environmental Voter Project is to put ourselves out of business. Like, boy, would we love to run out of non-voting environmentalists. That would be a damn fine day. And so, yeah, we take very seriously looking in the states where we are currently working to figure out, should we still be here? Are we still making an impact? Now, we have yet to find a state where we obviously should leave. But one of the things that we track is how many of these super voters are we creating or helping to create each year? And are those numbers plateauing? Because if there is some sort of like asymptotic leveling off, which we assume will happen at some point, right? Like there's some people who just will never vote and we're not going to be able to turn them. Once we see that leveling of off, we start to wonder like, okay, are we ready to leave this state? We have yet to see that 2 years in a row in any state. I'll say this past year, we saw some leveling off in Colorado and Massachusetts. If that continues for a few more years, we'll take that seriously. Absolutely. And we might leave those states. Because at the end of the day, you want us to be impactful, but believe me, like we want us to be impactful too. We really work hard and we do it because we believe in the results that we're getting. And so, although we haven't left any states yet, I fully expect us to. And we'll let the data lead us when that happens. All right. It is now exactly 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. Thank you all so much for being here. I am just going to keep you 1 minute long to just say, please take a moment to look in the chat for the links that have been shared. We all know, we've been on Zoom a lot, what happens when this ends. You're going to close out. You say, oh God, where was that link to sign up to volunteer? Where was that link to donate? Well, you can do yourself a favor by just clicking on it now so that it will be open. Boy, would we love to see you at some of these phone banks. Boy, would we love to have your financial support. Remember those crucially important elections that I mentioned that are coming up just in April and May. Crucially important elections. Your financial support goes a tremendously long way right now for a few reasons. One, as I said earlier, the cheapest, most efficient way to make a new voter in 2024 is to talk to them in 2023. But two, we get better results in odd years. Not because like we try harder or we are better, but because when the baseline level of turnout is lower, it is easier for us to have a more dramatic impact on the outcomes. And so simply put, you get more for your donation dollar right now than you would 12 months from now or 12 months ago. And same thing goes for volunteering. So please get back in the game, volunteer, donate, and finally, most importantly, thank you. I know that some of you on this Zoom have been with us for 3, 4, 5, 6. We are now in our 7th year, maybe some 7 years. We have now gotten to the point where we are in 19 states, red states, blue states, and purple states. We have spoken to 9.5 million unique voters, and we have helped turn 1.5 million of them into consistent super voters. Thank you. for being part of the Environmental Voter Project team. Thank you for helping us get this far. I hope that you take real pride in all that we have accomplished alongside you, because it is alongside all of you. So thank you. Thank you.